Okay, so before we dive in, we need to talk about what form is, as you understand it. What is form? Well, it's the elements and principles of design. It's how you make something, it's the texture, it's the shapes you employ, it's the lines that you utilize, it's the balance of a composition, okay? It is essentially how you make that image work as a design, and then the process is how you manipulate the materials, right? So in painting, that process can yield something very traditional, using a grisaille method and glazing, or it can be very contemporaneous and utilize completely unconventional painterly materials, right? Like weaving, right? These things combined together can essentially convey your content, right? So in art history, we have to kind of negotiate a lot when dealing with content, okay? Content can be essentially the conventions that have been inherited, and of course, within those conventions, there are going to be power structures, right? In history painting, right, history is written by the winners, right? Those will be inherited in power structures. You will see Western European painting about colonialism as a heroic feat, right? And certain styles will be a part of those conventions as well. Realism, naturalism, neoclassicism might be in there. And then the pictorial construction. How we read an image is inherited to us via not only the culture that we're brought up in, but also, you know, based on where we originate in the planet. In the West, we read images from the left to the right because that's how we typically read a book, which is why we read comic books the same way. Whereas in the East, we start on the other side, the right side, and read our way up. So this will also play a role in identity and identity politics. So content can deal with one's personal demographic, their age, their sex, their race, their gender, their orientation, whatever relating to their identity as culture constructs it. Content can also deal with, you know, postmodernism, popular culture, the world around us now. And then, of course, grand narratives and its associations. What are grand narratives? Man versus himself, man versus nature, right? What are the other ones? Man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature, man versus... I don't remember. Beast. No, nature. That's nature. Okay, I can't remember, but whatever, moving on.
What's that last painting?
The last painting is Takashi Murakami. Murakami. Takashi Murakami. And he is very, very famous. He's one of the wealthiest, highest selling artists working today. He has a whole studio that y'all should read about. All right. Content can also play a role in terms of creating an emotional, a psychic, or a psychological space, right? And objects can do that, obviously based on those conventions and signs, symbols, and emblems that we're all familiar with. It presumes that we're all a part of the same language within that pictorial dialect, right? There can be an ambiguous narrative. It can be clear. You can equate it to essentially prose versus poetry, being direct versus being open-ended, or more sensual, meaning of the senses. You have illustration, which is very direct and very much about a clear-cut interpretation, versus painting's history, which uses all sorts of cues, all sorts of hidden contextual things, visual puns, etc. We can use reference versus appropriation. So we can refer to something in history versus appropriating it, which is essentially stealing, right? And it's stealing with the purpose of recontextualizing it. So reference can be more of a direct thing. I make a painting after Turner, and it is a storm on a sea, right? Versus appropriation, I take that painting, I rip it up, and then I make a quilt out of it. Right? And then there's style versus choice. These things can be in flux. Style obviously plays a role in history, but also can be a personal expression. Right? But there's always a name for everything. There's been all sorts of movements, right? In terms of form, we can deal with all sorts of spatial issues. Naturalistic space, the stacking of a deep space versus a flat surface, which acknowledges paint as flat, right? Jackson Pollock, paint is paint, surface is surface, there is no depth. The object versus illusion. Am I looking at an art object, or am I looking at an art object that happens to be illusory? Or illusionistic, sorry. Is that object a theater? Is there an acting narrative going on within it, or is it simply the surface that I'm dealing with in terms of the form? So if we're thinking about form and content, we're thinking about the very important Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, right? Pivotal, changed everything. This is when cars were being invented. What we have here is a representation of women who are inherently, in this context, depicted as sexual. They are on display for our gaze and for our aesthetic appreciation. He has appropriated the visual language of African masks and African imagery, tribal imagery, that out of its context, back in its original context, could be considered spiritual and holy, right? We have cubism, which is fracturing space and taking away the conventions of naturalism and depth and making it flat, therefore acknowledging the paint on the surface. This image is a sort of cataclysm of all of the things that he is rejecting from the past, all of those conventions, to move forward, to create a new vision of what painting can be, thus creating an entire movement. So all those things he's using are traditional, but what he's doing is he's eschewing them. Marcel Duchamp, I'm appropriating found objects, reassembling, therefore recontextualizing, and creating a new experience that forces the viewer to contemplate the form. So it's a wheel, but out of this context, it's just a circle. It's a stool, I can't sit on it, so I've got to look at it differently. He's recontextualizing it so that we can essentially reconsider what the art experience should be. Is it about time? Is it about labor? Is it about the conventions of naturalism? No, it is not. Joan Mitchell, working in the abstract expressionist era in the 50s and 60s, a woman, working very large, like her male counterparts, working very physically, moving the paint around, not in a minute way that exercises her technical prowess in illusionism, but what she's doing is she's moving it around in such a way that aggressively acknowledges and embraces color, line, shape, and the painting's tactile quality. Willem de Kooning did the exact same thing. However, he would use things like pictures of women that he found in magazines, paste them on the surface of his canvas, and use that as a sort of stepping point, a jumping point, to make these non-objective abstract expressionist paintings. What are they about, though? Francis Bacon was doing the same sorts of things, but with the figure. And he was doing it to such a degree to create a mood of desolation and hopelessness. They are very limited in palette, they are very high contrast, they are very sharp in edge, but the areas that are psychologically pregnant, like facial features, are lost. And they're lost in this sort of slurry of abstraction in order to basically create an uncomfortable space for you psychologically. They appear as though, and are familiar in our sort of collective consciousness as images that we might see of soldiers coming back from a war, an injury. Alberto Giacometti, an Italian artist who's primarily a sculptor, but his paintings were, I think way better than the sculptures, but whatever. That's arguable. His portraits took a long time, believe it or not, a long time. And they're constructed using line after line after line after line after line, revision after revision after revision. And so naturalism isn't necessarily the focus, but it's labor and time. But labor and time reinvented. Instead of being about craftsmanship, instead of being about painting whiskers on a beard, it's essentially about labor in constructing this three-dimensional space as two dimensions. Pat Steer has been working for a long time. She's still alive. She makes these gigantic, I suppose you could call them abstract expressionists, gigantic paintings of splashes. And they're meant to be evocative of, obviously, your normal formal elements and principles of design, color, shape, right? But they're also meant to be incredibly violent images, images that are meant to acknowledge the body in both their scale, but also in this sort of liquid approach to the splash. They look a bit like waterfalls, but they're not in any way calming. Here's another Pat Steer. Cy Twombly is pulling from this sort of visual language of a child, of a toddler, creating or learning script. And what he's doing is he's assembling them in such a genius way. He's creating new compositions using this repeated motif of what seems to be clumsy, but what ends up being very elegant and very smartly decisive. More Cy Twombly. If we're thinking about the form of tradition would be to create a hyperrealist or very naturalistic space, right? And the conventions of art history would tell us that that yields a history painting. Well, what happens when you strip away the importance and you look at the banal and you reject any sort of notion that what you're depicting is worthwhile? Because what you could depict is something that is just an image that you'd overlook, right? An image that you might see every day on your commute to work. And to devote this kind of attention to something that is as empty as the reflection of a car window defies what history painting, or at least the conventions of naturalism, tell us should be. Sophie Jodine uses charcoal on mylar. Mylar is a plastic drawing surface. And she creates essentially photorealist images that she appropriates from online and various other sources. And she does that in order to create these sort of mystical, strangely uncomfortable portraits. And oftentimes she's evocative, sorry, that's a faraway image, but they're evocative of somebody like Francis Bacon. Fred Stonehouse is out of Milwaukee. Oh no, he's out of Madison. He's a painting professor in Madison, Wisconsin. And he uses all sorts of appropriation, especially from the language of tattoo and lowbrow illustration. But he uses the conventions of religious iconography and the skill sets of, say, a retablo, a Catholic retablo, in such a masterful way that you have to take them seriously. Ghada Amer is a Middle Eastern, now American artist who appropriates from pornography. Specifically, she appropriates from pornography that is depicting women who are in seemingly pleasured moments. They are getting pleasure. And obviously, if we think about this in any way, shape, or form, images of women in pornography are false, right? That's a false kind of acting pleasure. And what she does is she collaborates with a variety of, another guy, I can't remember his name, in order to stitch them, in order to create these, what looks like initially abstract expressionist paintings. You don't really discover what they are until you really look at them for a long period of time. And so they become sort of jokes, visual puns about the masculine qualities of non-objective abstraction, how women are excluded from them, and then this sort of like weird, masturbatory, feminine context. And a lot of feminists have actually criticized her because she genuinely thinks these women are experiencing pleasure, which of course is arguable, but whatever. It would essentially come straight from the mouth of, whoever is the actress. Victor Mann paints these sort of, ethereal images that are very, very strange, that seem to be evocative of a photorealist bent, maybe from museums, maybe images he takes himself, but we can't really understand the content, but we do understand the mood. And when we're thinking about things like mood, we're thinking about limiting our color, softening an edge, thinking about ambiance, thinking about the tactile quality of, say, fur against a painting of someone donned in latex. That's a sensual experience. So how something is presented is equally important. Another Victor Mann, they're very dark, difficult to kind of decipher here and there, but they're very, very beautiful. Toba Arbok is an artist you should all know. She is a non-objective abstract artist. However, these are not folds. What she does is she takes canvas that has been unprimed and she manipulates it in a sort of, it's cloth, manipulates it into sort of folds or little creases, and then uses an industrial sprayer at an angle to create a mimetic fold. So they look like they're trompe-l'oeil, and then she stretches them flat. So they're not actually folded, but they were at one time, and that spraying action actually captured that. So what then is the purpose of traditional naturalism? She's making a naturalistic trompe-l'oeil. However, that is not in any way the traditional definition that she employs. Here's some of her work in person. Leslie Vance is an artist who makes images that look like really goopy, non-objective abstractions that might have been made in the 60s. They aren't. They're very small, they're very humble, and they're painted using really, really slow layers of glaze. So they're done like action paintings, but they're painted in a way that is very tender. Tomori Dodge is a sort of, you could call him a landscape painter, but they're more non-objective than anything, but they definitely are evocative of landscape, which is meant to be calming, right? It's meant to be about property, it can be about, the vista, the future, whatever you want it to be. But what he does is he plays with paint to such a degree that they do touch on the action painting of the 50s and 60s. He'll do things like take the tube of paint, and he'll just simply squeeze the entire tube of paint down the surface of the painting. So they're very, very active paintings that sort of challenge your space because they're not thin in any way, shape, or form. They come out at you like a sculptural surface. Another one of his work. Wade Goyton uses a kind of like silkscreen effect. They're done on like signage. But he reappropriates and recontextualizes them by creating these sort of new compositions, thus looking like an advertisement, but sterile and stripped down so that you become unaware of what the product is. This is out of order a little bit. This, no, that's his work, sorry. That's Wade Goyton's work. These are on mattresses. And why are they on mattresses? Well, you can make a lot of arguments about why they're on mattresses, but they are essentially a cloth stretched over a form that is rigid, which is essentially a canvas. So it can be about the history of painting. Sarah Croner actually sews her work. So she makes non-objective abstractions but simply out of colored cloth. And there's a view of her studio. Good stuff. Hannelina Rogeberg, man, I love her. I think she makes really interesting work. She really is part of this sort of fractured figuration that's going on right now. She toys with and plays with the inherent abstraction of the figure itself. One of my little favorite paintings is the testicles, which out of context just simply looks like an atmospheric painting that you can't identify, but is really kind of funny once you figure it out. More her work, Hannelina Rogeberg, where she's appropriated from images that are from the newspaper, specifically ones where the Al-Qaeda, no, not Al-Qaeda, the political party that, in Iraq, Hussein, what was his name? The president of Iraq, his name was? Saddam Hussein's regime. Finding this man, I can't remember his name, but he was identified as a terrorist, but he's a part of that regime. And the terrible pictures that they took of him while they were interrogating him. Albert Olin is actually very important. He is an artist that uses a lot of processes, including silkscreen, collage, action painting, and he creates these sort of unconventional paintings that are incredibly bright and apropos for the color sort of design palette that one might use today. It's around a corner.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's around a corner. But they really do pull from sort of lower brow imagery. I believe I had that poster in my room when I was a freshman in high school. Beatrice Melhayes is a Brazilian artist who pulls from design motifs from the 70s. And what she'll do is, in terms of her process, she will paint on plastic sheeting in acrylic. And when you paint on plastic sheeting in acrylic, the side that you paint onto the plastic is completely smooth if you peel it off. And you can actually peel it off by just taking clear acrylic, putting it on the other side, sticking to it to a canvas or a panel, waiting for it to dry, and then peeling it off like a sticker. And so that's how these images are made, one over the other, over the other, over the other. And she displays them in spaces that are essentially very bright, poppy, and very evocative of the designs of the 70s. As a Brazilian woman, it obviously reiterates the kind of aesthetic voice of her cultural identity. Tropical. Marilyn Minter is primarily a photorealist. She also does photos as well, but she shoots professional models, like professional fashion models, high-end fashion models, but in these sort of filthy arrangements in like mud or glitter or charcoal in their teeth, that kind of thing. And so she creates these photorealist paintings that are huge with the type of paint that you would use in order to paint a car model, the small car models, which is called enamel. And she doesn't, for the most part, use a brush. She uses her fingers. She's actually a very important artist. They're very impressive images. And it's essentially about changing the way we expect the conventional naturalism to happen in a painting, right? Photorealism isn't that old. It's only like 50 years old. So what's interesting about her is that she's making what normally would be conceived of as beautiful into something that is about grotesque consumption, which is what we do as the male gaze, or as the male identified gaze, looking in at images of women. Mama Anderson is a Swedish artist who kind of invents landscapes. And in terms of her tone, they very much are conventional, but she works in such a sort of looser, abstract way that they touch on this sort of ambiguity of not only the space, the time, the narrative, and of course the mood is very ambiguous as well. So this lack of specificity and space and time yields a kind of haunting strangeness. Neil Tate is a Brit who paints images that are directly taken from newspapers. And he'll draw and trace these little line drawings on top of transparency paper and then project them and then invent from there. Kerry James Marshall is an artist who pulls from history painting. If you watch his Art 21, which I'd love for you to watch, his Art 21, he taught at Art Institute of Chicago. He talks exclusively about how to learn, take, and borrow from history painting and the conventions and compositional structures that are used in such a large scale. His work is very, very large. And he works in such a way that aggrandizes the black figure, and he paints them not brown, he paints them black, so that they are undeniably black. And he is an African-American artist who is essentially appropriating a different language with his own voice that has been, that it hasn't had a platform. Matthias Weisser, a German, creates these spaces, these weird, ambiguous spaces that are not quite flat, but they kind of look cut up, and they're kind of confusing in terms of space, but they're sort of realistic, and they're painted in such a way that is undeniably about paint. See that licked right off the edge there? So they are truly pointing to the fact that they are objects.
What does he paint on?
He paints on canvas, typically. They are objects, but they are also illusions. His name is Matthias Weisser. Sorry, I didn't hear you. Katarina Gross, she's using spray, and she is transforming the space itself. So she's throwing away the fact that it needs to be an object, and she's embracing the idea that art is about an experience, that painting can be about an experience. And it can throw away this talismanic focus that the art object is the end-all, say-all in a transformative experience. Some installations of her work. James Sienna makes very conventional small easel paintings using invented patterns that he paints painstakingly using pinstriping, using just a straight edge and a very, very, very small brush. He is essentially pulling from the tradition of the mandala, of the repeated motif that we might see in an Eastern culture in order to create a kind of meditation on color and form. David Ratcliffe, I like him a lot. He's not incredibly prolific, but he does these stencil paintings that are exclusively made out of spray paint. And they are an amalgam of images that sometimes you can put your finger on and kind of identify, and sometimes you can't. But obviously, they're meant to look like non-objective abstract paintings. Glen Brown, who we'll end on today, is a painter that I really follow. And I think he's very interesting in both form and content. He's a British painter who, like many of you, grew up lower middle class. And he didn't really have access to a lot of art in his life, even though there's a ton of art in Europe and in Great Britain. And so what he did is he pored over books, and he loved art history books, but he also pored over sci-fi, and he pored over, fantasy images that are painted, right? And so later in life, as part of his sort of oeuvre, he's pulling from all of those things, completely appropriating them. He might change the color, he might change the surface, but he paints them in such a glossy, fine way that they're so slick that you can see your reflection in them. So they're painted using the conventional method of Hans Holbein, which is layer over layer over layer of oil glaze, while trying to suggest a kind of surface that is impastoed, like on that foot, which is actually a Menzel painting. That's a very famous painting of a foot. It's a beautiful foot. He paints it in a kind of necrotic way, like decomposing flesh, but that is radioactive. And what I think he's trying to say with the work is the most interesting thing. Because if you don't have access to art directly, to the art object that we all fantasize about, that we commodify, that we make into some like holy relic, if you don't have access to that growing up, you think art is very different than it actually is. And so what he's doing is he's modifying these already consumed images and making them just like the glossy pages of the books that he pored over as a child. Because he doesn't know, or didn't know, what these images and surfaces would have looked like. So I will end there and start